very deep problematical relation between language and concepts, which has been at the heart of philosophy in all traditions. But just to indicate that, let me begin with a very simple example, because things like Indian etc. becomes a bit more because it's become more provocative, because we are already immersed in certain kinds of debates. So let me start with an example of how this problem is true across any concept you use. Any concept, you name any concept from your discipline, we can do the same kind of a discussion that I'll do for an exam. I'll do for 3 or 4 concepts, and I can tell you that you can do it for anything. You bring a concept and I'll discuss with you about that, because that's the same kind of problems that arise in the very idea of concepts. And concepts are central to our ways of understanding the world. In fact, one of the, I would say, the fundamental process of human cognition is to order the world according to concepts. And when we order the world according to concepts, we are creating a particular world. So for example, simple, I mean, we should always work, for me in my case, work with the simplest example, so that all of us can agree or disagree with, right? So I can start with a very simple example. I am standing in front of you and I can say, well, in front of me there are 100 chairs, right? That seems a very reasonable description. There is no politics involved in that, I hope. There is no ideology. There are 100 chairs in front of me in this room. But this statement, the function of language here is to represent the world as I see it, or to describe the world as I see it. But in describing the world that there are 100 chairs in front of me, I hope you realize that that sentence is false. It's deeply false. It's totally false, because there are no 100 chairs in front of me. What the function of language is doing here is to take something which I see, and this is the larger connection to experience we spoke about yesterday, but today I will avoid that E word, because it seems to perturb a lot of people. So we will just talk about what I see in front of me. I hope I close my eyes, open my eyes, 100 chairs in the room. Are there 100 chairs in the room? Would a dog which comes and stands in front of me and is looking at all of you, is it going to say there are 100 chairs in the room? I hope you see the point, that what you have done is you have conceptualized your experience, or you have conceptualized what you have seen. You are not describing what you have seen. You have conceptualized it how? There are 100. What is this 100? There is no 100 in this room. Or do you think 100 is there in this room? That thing called 100, I don't know what it is. Chairs, are there chairs in this room? There are no chairs in this room, right? What there is an object, if at all is an object. There is, okay, let me put it, the easiest way of saying this, there is that and 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 that. That's all that there is in the room. The moment I create a concept called chair, which somehow recognizes, so it does something more than perception. Perception is just seeing as it is. The concept chair is immediately recognizing that all of them are the same, and I can call them as 100. So I create another concept called 100, which is a count of the number of similar things, but I already recognize similarity in these things, and I have recognized that actually they can all belong to the same word or same reference, if you like, and that numbers allows me to put the count of how many things there are, and therefore I describe what seems to be truthful, but is not the only way of talking about my experience of the room. Even the simple example, forget about talking about complicated questions. There is oppression in society, there is poverty in society, power functions in these particular ways. I mean, to make sense of 100 chairs is difficult. So you can imagine why social science is a very deeply difficult question, and you will also see how science responds to this. And it's, to me, I think it's very, very important when you, especially when you do contemporary philosophy, you have to have an account of the function of a philosophy and history of science, because they are deeply related to it. I won't talk about this, but since I know many of you are interested in this field, etc., and you are working with continental thought and so on, you have to engage with a very important tradition in philosophy of science, because so much of Western philosophy is deeply indebted to that relationship, and that's the relationship with mathematics. It's an extremely interesting relation. Western philosophy, to a very great extent, is modeled on the ideas of mathematics, and the function of mathematics becomes central core of how philosophy wants to present itself. It happens right up to Deleuze, since you are all doing Deleuze here. So, I don't know how many of you came to the first Deleuze conference we did at Manipal. So, where I actually did 2 sessions on the tutorial on Deleuze and mathematics, just to show how deeply the question of mathematics influences Western thought. And it is also important to distinguish other traditions of thinking. Asian and African thought do not make the kind of metaphysical assumptions about mathematics that is essential to Western thought. It is a deeply divisive ways of looking at the world and the role of mathematics. So, you would actually, I think, find it very helpful, not to read these thinkers as independent people who have said something about the world, but see them in the history. Deleuze is responding to certain problems in his tradition. He is responding to Kant, he is responding to Hegel. You are, like I was telling some of the students today morning, I think the best way to describe this is this: when you read Deleuze, you are actually overhearing a fight within one house. Your neighbor's house, something is happening, somebody is saying some void, this, that. We are overhearing from that, and the reason why Deleuze is saying that is he is responding to problems posed within the tradition by various people. Correct? We listen to it and say, oh, that's also my problem. We incorporate their problem as our problem without recognizing the historicity of that problem. What is Deleuze trying to answer? What is the problem he is trying to respond? What is the problem Kant is trying? So, in the case of Kant, I am sure many of you have heard it a million times, especially philosophy students, but those who are not, one of the often quoted thing about Kant is response, he is mediating between 2 oppositions, between the rationalists and the empiricists. He is mediating between Leibniz and Hume. He wants to find a middle path, a very similar notion of middle path which happens much before with Nagarjuna, whose whole text itself is called Moola Madhyamika Karika, which is a middle between oppositions. How do you find the middle path? To say, somebody says the whole world is unreal, somebody says there's only world is completely real. Then you come as a middle path like the Kantian. But if you don't know what the problems of Hume and Leibniz are, how are you going to read Kant? And you don't know why Hume is saying what he is saying and what Leibniz is saying what he is saying. Leibniz, for example, deeply influenced by the metaphysics of mathematics. He is a mathematician first of all. And then here you have Hume, who is an empiricist and saying something which seems to be very opposite, and you need Kant to come and mediate between them. To understand the answer, you have to know the question. We are reading answers without knowing questions, and so there is a big problem of how you make sense of all these kind of theoretical. I am talking of larger theory, I am not talking just of philosophy. Typically in a theoretical, in the construction of theory is responding, trying to give an account of, give an answer to certain puzzles and problems. And so a way to meaningfully understand that is to have your complete mapping of the kind of issues which create those questions, and then try and make sense of the answers based on that. Okay. So, I am sorry, I don't even know what I was talking about. Anybody remember what I was saying before I? What? Concepts, yes, concepts and language question, yeah. So, yeah, just to indicate that question, and that's why I went back onto the question of science, I'll come back to it. Is that all concepts seem to function? 100 chairs in the room, sorry, that's what we're talking about. And the fact that you create a concept called chair. So, you could ask, I asked you about a dog, but you could think of another human community who is standing in front of you and they don't have the word 100. Okay, and there are many early so-called pre-modern systems where people had numbers like the first human counting system is 1, 2, 3, 4 and many, or 1, 2, 3 and many, because counting is so digitalized, right. So suppose you think of a community of a people, because I hate to don't want to call them as tribals, as if all tribals can't count more than 5. So we will just call them as a people who comes and says there are many, I don't know, what will they say? Will they say, are there many things in the room? They may not even say, you see the point what is happening. That is, even to say a simple statement like there are 100 chairs, there are many chairs, there are many objects, each one of them is your imposition, you are framing the room according to the concepts you have. Even to say an objects in the room is to recognize these are all, suppose I don't want to call 100 chairs in the room, I could say there are 100 objects in the room, and I hope you see how different these two sentences are. 100 objects is different from 100 chairs. 100 objects says there are 100 things I can count. It says more about counting, not about the objects. 100 chairs is saying something a lot about the objects, the fact that they are all similar and they are not independent or different objects. You could say many things about this room. It's the same perception. Your cognition, your conceptual cognition orders it each time very differently. That is the puzzle of this problem of the concepts. When you talk about any concept, you are playing this game. And therefore, the relationship between concepts and language is a deeply contentious one. I will end with that, because I think for us working in India, that is an extremely important question. Definitely for those of you who do field work, it is the most important question in my view, but I will try and end with it so we can have a meaningful idea where to go with this. What can we do as practicing researchers? So let me give you an example of how concepts and meaning are often contentious. Indian is a concept. So we had all this discussion, what do you mean by Indian? When you are saying Indian, what does you mean, etc. So in the same way, let us talk about the concept, a very simple concept, which I am sure all of us know very well what it is, and you are sitting in IIT Kharagpur, so we can talk more about this concept, which is the concept science. Okay, just look at the word science. Now science functions as a concept. I think everybody thinks we know what science is, because remember that when we say some people, what they do is not science. So when people say tribal medicine is not science, or when they say Unani is not science, they are saying something. They are saying, well, it does not fall under my concept called science. That is one way of looking at it. You can say it does not fall under the membership of this club called science. They may not want to take you. All of us will not be accepted in membership into all clubs. So in what sense is, when somebody says tribal medicine is not science, what do they actually, what could they be meaning? What is this meaning of the word science? Because whenever people use the word science, you can ask them the same questions you ask for Indian, exactly the same questions, there is no difference. And let me tell you, the people who have asked this question, we do not ask this question because we are at the receiving hierarchy as non-science, I mean I am saying we means I am assuming most of us are non-science students, or even if you are not, let us assume that for the case today. Say as the members of a lower hierarchy of this, we say if somebody says, oh, I am doing science, you are not going to ask them, oh, how can you use the word science? What do you mean by doing science? Because if you ask them that, they have very little clue. And this is the fundamental question of philosophy of science. What is it to do? What is it that constitutes science? So suppose I want to use science as a concept, and the question has been posed by scientists, not by us. In what sense? They do not directly ask what is science. I will give you one very good story of I don't know how many of you have heard about cold fusion. This grand discovery in late 80s, 90s of a group of chemists, electrochemists, who discovered the next grand dream of science, which is cold fusion, from which you will get as much energy as you want, and your all human life can be very happy and all that stuff. So cold fusion was a very much of a holy grail, and the first example of cold fusion was announced by these two chemists at the University of Utah. There's a very good story. Any of you who do sociology of science should go look at the story of it, on how science actually functions and how the university and the PR department pressurize them to talk about it. And there's so much at stake. If it had been true, it's a really a major money making enterprise, right? So when the story broke, it was carried in all the newspapers across the world. It was a major story, and they went and asked one very famous physicist at Harvard, who was a Nobel Prize winner, who is a particle physicist. They went and asked some reporter asked him, what is your opinion about this? Okay, and this guy says, and this is his answer, almost verbatim, I don't remember the exact words, but he said, well, that can't be true because they are chemists. What do they know about the atom? It's quite, what he was saying is deeply representative of the foundational problem of a concept, defining a concept called science, because that's part of a long history where physicists who thought they were the paradigm of doing science looked at other disciplines as if they don't belong to science. How is chemistry a science? Chemistry actually is a very interesting, wonderful example of how chemistry becomes a science, and chemistry is not a science. That is, you put the conceptual category of looking at chemistry as a science, you will then make chemistry do certain things. Chemistry is about, if you remember your school chemistry, the greatest thing about chemistry was what? Its color, its smell. Everything had these bubbling colors, smells, textures. It's actually a very sensuous discipline, and chemistry becomes a science when it removes all the sensuality out of chemistry. For chemistry to be a science, you will not say chlorine is greenish in color, it has pungent taste. That's only for high school, middle school textbooks. After that middle school textbook, no scientist will ever describe chemistry, chlorine as that color and smell and making you cough and all that, because it's completely irrelevant. The only definition of chlorine is in terms of its atomic structure. That's it. There is no secondary qualities, sensory qualities associated with in the whole world of chemicals, this whole world of smells and tastes, for it to be called a science. Biology is a bigger problem. Nobody knows why biology is a science. Biology does not do some of the most basic things which physics does. There are no laws. First thing you learn about physics is laws of physics. Newton's law, gravitational law, everything is a law in physics. E equal to mc squared is a law, Pauli's principle. Go to any discipline within that, it's all about laws. Different types of laws, but they're all laws. Biological laws are not like physics laws. Evolution is one of the most deeply troubling questions within biology, because people try to attempt to make biology a science by modeling evolution. Evolution is about time. It's between history and chance. It's really social science comes science, and that's why social science origin is deeply indebted to Darwin and the engagement of biology as a mediating science between natural science and social science. It's a transition point, and biology doesn't get mathematized like physics. So one of the markers of being science was to do mathematics. You have to have mathematical description of the world. Chemistry, unless it borrows physics, it doesn't have that. Biology doesn't have that at all. Even evolution was a grand failure of mathematical modeling. So in what sense is biology then a science? Then you go to social sciences, situation gets worse, and that's why those of you who are in sociology etc. know how this tremendous struggle to move from quantification to modeling and the resistance to qualitative methods within social sciences. And then at the other extreme is literature. You're actually caught between this attempt to conceptualize something, find that similar. Just like suppose I had said there are no 100 chairs because I know that these chairs are not similar. I will not accept that they are similar. The moment you say 100 chairs, you already accepted they are all similar. they are all the same things can be put under the word chair. But cognitively, we know that all the chairs are different, correct? There is at least one property which is different in all the chairs. You will agree? Let's assume it all looks the same, but still there is one property which is different. Which is what? Well, there are two properties, there are many properties. Quickly, one property, that they are all occupied at different spaces. So, if location is a property of what the chairs are, then they are all located at different spaces. They all have different origins. They could all they've all been obviously created at different times. They have been created by different people. So, the more kinds of difference you discover in the objects, you may not want to put them as the same kind within the same family. If you want to, you can also give arguments as to why you should put them in together. So, which means to say there are 100 chairs in the room is not the only way of talking about this room, and you have to do work to put them under certain conceptual categories. And the definition of science functions in the same way. So, the whole debate and fight repeatedly about whether social science is a science, and now and on top of it, everybody wants to call themselves a science because you get more funding. So, you have management science, sports science, library science was first, then you have hospitality science. I saw a big hoarding that day on a new undergraduate program on hospitality science. Then there is wine science, and something very special to India which is not there anywhere else. I think it's just like the constitutional scientific temper thing is home science. And home science, I don't know if any of you have ever encountered home science. It's actually a very interesting and I think a very important topic. SNDT University, I discovered, has actually a PhD program in home science, and so I was very curious as how they define themselves as science, and it was there in the SNDT website, but you can go check it out again if it's still there. There it says home science. Why is home science a science? So, I asked somebody who was a teacher there, I said, what do you guys teach actually? And she said, well, they teach them child rearing, they also have cooking classes, they have various kinds of home things as part of training. It has a terrible history which I think the feminists should really look at more seriously. It's like preparing a woman for marriage with that transition time, you know, when she has just finished school or something like that. And it's legitimized by the state. It's a state which produces home science. It begins in the US actually as what is called home economics, to train wives to manage husband's salary. So, they thought that they should scientifically train these women, because women don't know how to manage money, and that therefore hopefully some scientifically train them to manage money. And in India it becomes, from home economics it becomes home science, and they do all this stuff. But they sent it. Yeah.
If you see the home science books of Uttar Pradesh class 6 to 12, the state government, you will find that there's lots of biology and chemistry.
Now come into that,
home science, not now. It is, I'm talking about 6 years back. When I was in, I mean not 6, maybe 10 years back. I used to see my sister's books that they used to study. Point number 1.
Yeah.
And point number 2 is that this training of wives can also be seen as training of husbands, because you see, the two chairs are different.
Yeah,
so
yeah.
why should we believe that only women are going to be trained? Even a man can study. You know?
Yeah, except if you go to home science colleges, you would also find something very interesting about home science college. The first famous home science college I knew was in Bangalore, called Maharani's College for Women. Right opposite there was a home science college which only took girl students. If you had applied for home science college, I doubt you will get it. You know, and you can't go tell that principal, no, don't look at conceptual categories, man, woman, I am also whatever. But there is this, you know, home science seems to have had this. I don't know how the SNDT works.
For the new principal to come.
Yeah, or look at what, I don't know, I think it'd be interesting to see what SNDT has done. But what is interesting with the SNDT website, it says, what is home science? They define it, and they say scientific utilization of domestic resources. So, it's a variation of the economy, but it's a scientific utilization, you know, which is like if a man or a woman is cooking, you can do scientific utilization of recipe. Recipes is, by the way, a scientific manifestation of cooking. You count measure, it has been reproduced, there is a recipe for it. It's like doing an experiment, and it's a verifiable experiment, it's predictable. You can do all that, correctly measure 1 spoon of this, 2 spoons of that, and make it, and that's part of the science. So what I'm trying to say is, science as an act very rarely functions according to these tenets. There is no science which functions like physics. So you have to ask, whenever somebody says science, you have to ask, okay, in what sense are you meaning by science? But we still are able to allow the word science to be used across disciplines. Why is that? How is that possible? Why doesn't that bother us? What is it about culture, cultural concepts that we want to take ownership, but not for certain, cognitive concepts like science? And these are, this is within the scientific community, there is this big problem. So when projects proposals are sent for funding, if people don't see that it follows their idea of science, project proposals will get rejected. And as I said, the problem about social science is very deep and runs through the thing. So there are two very important questions which you need to take from science, because it gives you an idea how these concepts. So we essentialize certain aspects. For physics definition of science, you essentialize the question of mathematics, which means it's actually a question of language. Language is the central core of what constitutes science in a very, very central way. It's embodied in mathematics. We can talk about things otherwise. But when you take this question to the historical domain, people are very comfortable accepting Greek science. But the moment you say Indian science or Chinese science or African science or tribal science, it becomes a bit of a problem. There, the question is not about epistemology, it's not about conceptual. Okay, we'll talk about this later if any of you, I hope some of you disagree with what I'm saying, so that we can have a dialogue about it. But in this case, it's very deeply ideological. So what I'm trying to say is this: the conceptual ordering of the world can occur through a certain cognitive process, that I see all this as being similar, so I'm going to group them as 100 chairs. You see them as being dissimilar, so you classify them as 100 objects, not 100 chairs. Similarly, in the context of the definition of Greek science, Indian science, Chinese science, etc., we see the phenomena through different conceptual categories, and I feel that, well, you will have to make a distinction. So when the moment you invoke Indian science, there's a lot of worry about it, but you would use terms for German science, Greek science. I mean, Greek science, just as a very quick one-line thing, I'm not, I hope you don't see me as very anti-Greek, but I love the Greeks or whatever they are. One of the classical scholars, I think he's one of these US, he's a very famous classic scholar. Once I was talking to him about this Greek thing, he suddenly, he's a huge guy, a very excited personality in a public meeting. He suddenly got up and said, there is nothing called Greek, there's nothing called Greek, there is no Greek philosophy, that's all wrong. And he was saying, as a historian, you can't call them, by the way, next time anybody tells you about Indian, tell them there's nothing called Greek. Aristotle and Plato were not Greeks. They belong to different islands, Aegean island. So he was saying how you should call them is not Greek, but you'll have to call them this, whatever, here's some 2 or 3 names for it. So, what I'm trying to say is, one way of ordering is cognitive, other ways of ordering is ideological. The ways in which I like to see the world, not the way in which I see the world. For example, humanity, the idea of human. You may think, well, is human as a concept a cognitive concept? Is it that I stand in front of the room and say, oh, there are 50 humans in front of me? How often have you ever thought of the world which we experience as humans in front of us? But yet, human is a very powerful categorization. And one of the classic examples is about, and it happens I think in all kinds of hate crimes, but the Holocaust is one of the classic tropes of this. When people asked, when they did interviews with the concentration camp commanders and others, and they asked them, how is it, how did you do what you did to all these Jews? What allowed you to send these millions of people to their death? Women and children. And one of the commandant, I mean the guy who was running one of these camps says, he's not even perturbed, right? He says, well, we had no problem because they were not humans. We didn't have, we were not thinking of them as it was like sending animals to slaughter. It didn't matter to us. And because it didn't matter to us, I could do what he did. But remember, therefore you see how the conceptual category functions. By not recognizing them as belonging to the conceptual world of humans, allows them a particular form of legitimization of certain actions. If you go look at the partition narratives, the major Hindu-Muslim riots, this thing repeatedly comes. They are not humans. How often do you hear the right, the Hindu write about the Muslim attacks, or that they are not humans? What is it? I mean, so that what is it that you are doing? The world is presented to you, but we order it, and our capacity to allocate the human label on each one of us allows me to function with you in a different way than, for example, suppose we didn't have the concept human and we just had the word concept animal. It is true that there are 50 okay, if people cut and paste the sentence, it'd be very dangerous. Suppose somebody says, not me, suppose somebody says, somebody comes who doesn't have the concept humans and says, oh, there are 50 animals in front of me. It would be right, there's nothing wrong with it. But as I said, if somebody just says, oh, today Sundar said there are 50 animals in front of me, I'll be in trouble with the university and others, because how can I say there are 50 animals in front of me? But what if I didn't have the concept human? In other words, your description, human animals are very obvious cases, but imagine you are describing a very complex social process. You are describing technology, for example, since you have heard so much about Deleuze and all that. How are you going to describe it? If for the simple thing of the room itself there is so much of complexity, suddenly you have a technological object and you want to theorize about it. You want to ask some philosophical questions. You take a mobile or something and say, oh, what is this? I want to talk about this. The easiest way is to incorporate concepts which others have given. That's why it's called literature survey. So you do literature survey, get all these concepts, say, oh, I can call this, what do you want to call it? I don't know. Let's call it void. Sounds good. This is a planarium void or substantial infinity in this or something like that. And then it sounds very interesting, but how is the use of your concepts happening when you describe a technology or this particular object or this tool? With the question of chairs, it seems a little more obvious. It has a long history of how you want to use these terms. How do you therefore think anew, think fresh about this encounter with technology? What are you going to deploy? What are your weapons of deployment of ordering it through this conceptual category? So what should I be looking at? Should I be looking at the way technology is produced? Should I look at science? Should I look at literature? Should I look at Deleuze? Should I look at Buddha? I don't know. What is it that you have to do to get this idea about making sense of it? What is our role as a cognitive agent in encountering the experience around us, so that you can write something fresh? Like this is exactly what Latour and Deleuze and others are doing, right? They are seeing the same world, sitting outside watching it. They are deploying concepts to reorder these things, to make you think about these things differently. That's basically the way in which our thinking about something happens. So I am interested in how you will formulate new ways of thinking about it, rather than mimetically using concepts to describe it. With chairs, we can start thinking a little more about it, because we think I have a sense of understanding, I have a sense of ownership on this thing. I can say, well, I don't want to call it chair. Why don't I call it there are 100 kurchis in the room? Or maybe instead of 100, I want to say something. I can think of all kinds of ways of talking about it. But when you encounter things like technology and other things, and you want to think fresh about them, how do you actually do it? Okay, so I'm saying you have to be a little bit aware of the functions of these questions of concepts, and therefore you have to be very careful about not giving in to hegemony of certain conceptual constructions. I think hegemony of conceptual constructions is okay. I mean, what I mean by that is the concepts that I use to describe my experiences are derived from somewhere, something, and all that you have to do is to have a egalitarian access to these concepts. I am not saying, you know, whether it's Deleuze or Kant or Nayayikas or the Chinese or the African conceptual schema is best or wrong. I don't know what it is. I mean, that's a larger question, but I'm just saying you have to be open to an egalitarian possibility of looking at conceptual world in order to order your experiences. If each one of you is doing field work or whose work is based on information from the field, from people you encounter and talk to, you are doing this. And you know, I'll come at the end and see how we can actually engage with it. Okay, very quickly, the second great example, I'll just go through this rapidly now, because I think you get a general idea. For example, even the conceptual term called mathematics is very difficult. You know, there is no one mathematics, by the way. In fact, it's actually very interesting. Those of you who are math students will know that the first simplest example of mathematics is arithmetic. Then there may be a little bit of geometry, you know, the basic planar geometry. And then there are all kinds of creatures within mathematics. When you come to Riemannian geometry, which is not Euclidean planar geometry, it's very different. It breaks the basic tenets. So, for example, the shortest distance between 2 points is a straight line, parallel lines do not meet. These are the axioms of the Euclidean planar geometry, school geometry. And then you go to Riemannian, these two don't hold, these principles don't hold, but you would still want to call them geometry. And then you have disciplines like topology, you know, now category theory, I mean all kinds of crazy sub-disciplines within mathematics, and we are willing to call them all as mathematics. Nobody is asking the question, why should that be called mathematics? Because science and mathematics, the decision to call science and mathematics as science or mathematics is given to an authority. There is a very specific authority who can give you the stamp, oh, this is science, this is mathematics. In fact, after all this debate came, everybody was starting science and maths. All the science organizations in the world started giving definitions of science. So you have the famous, you know, very often used one on the American Science Association, also the British Association, which defines what they mean by science, and which will take a call on whether a new discipline is a science or not. So which means authority is invested in a group of people who will say, oh, this is science, this is not science. But the problem with cultural concepts is that there are no uniform authority to tell you whether this is philosophy, this is not philosophy, this is literature. People say Indian, there is no literature in India. Famous thing of Salman Rushdie and what happened, right? Or questions like that. What does it mean? Who is there to give you that stamp? Because of this problem, science organization did it, maths organizations did it. So in other words, giving a concept is an institutional process. Recognizing that something is science or mathematics becomes an institutional granting. It is not a cognitive recognition. That is, it's not by seeing a discipline, I know, oh, I know for sure this is science. Oh, I know for sure this is mathematics. No. If you don't get published in mathematical journals, if you are not eligible for awards within mathematics for the work you do, or if you don't, you know, get hired in a mathematics department, you will not be given that stamp. The best way to deny that stamp is by not taking you in those departments. Departments function that way. For example, a lot of Indian people who work on Indian philosophy in UK and the US all get jobs in the religious study department. They may be working on Indian logic, for example, but their job will be in the religious study department, not in the philosophy department. And that's part of the institutional validation or non-validation of what you call as your discipline. So concepts, that's what I'm trying to say, the larger lesson here is that there are many, even the word mathematics can have very many different meanings. There are implications because of our understanding of what mathematics is, but you can put them under one family or not depending on certain power interests. So I'm trying to bring the question of power back into your conceptual recognition of the world. okay, even in simple things like maths and science. And when it comes to philosophy, of course, it becomes far more problematical. And yesterday, after my talk, I was talking to Jenny, what's her name, Jenny, and she was, she had a very important critique of this point. She said, look, why do you want to keep saying, Indian philosophy, etc.? It's not philosophy. What is the problem in saying if there is nothing called Indian philosophy? Why don't you have your own name for it? Call it with your name, whatever name you want to call. What did you guys call it? So let's say some traditions call it darshana. So you call it darshana, darshanik, as an idea of perception. So why do you want to call it philosophy? And it's a very valid point, but it's a completely mistaken point, because concepts don't function that way. She's talking about it as, she said, well, philosophy is a Greek word, as you all know. Philosophy is love of wisdom, philosophia, which also becomes the Arabic falsafa, which is very similar. It's only the Arabs who actually save the Greek. If it is not for them, there would be no Greek philosophy today. It's a very artificial father for European thought, but they don't like to hear it, but there's enough history for it. But the point is this: should we all now refer to Chinese, African, whatever, Indian, etc., with some other names? All of us call it some other names, or call it as philosophy? Does philosophy function as a concept given as a label, or does it function as a cognitive concept? So when we are disagreeing because we are understanding the word philosophy in two different ways. I would say, if you understand philosophy as a set of practices in the English language across the world, then whosoever is doing the similar practice gets clubbed under philosophy. But if she wants to understand philosophy in terms of the word meaning, then whosoever is doing that word meaning which the Greeks supposedly did, although the practices may be very similar, cannot be called, so Indian things cannot be called philosophy. But what is ironic is, that's the same reason why the whole continental tradition is not called philosophy by analytical philosophers, because analytical philosophy does not do anything which the continental philosophers are doing. And so they will say, why is Deleuze a philosopher? They hate it. In fact, when we did the first Deleuze conference at Manipal, one of the philosophers was in Delhi, Mumbai, he sent me a strong email. He was really upset. He said, you are promoting charlatans like Deleuze and others in the name of philosophy. This is very bad for the whole philosophy community. And first of all, I had hired people who worked in philosophy, so he was very upset about that. And he said the only form of philosophy, the only meaning of philosophy is only if you study Plato and Aristotle. And you cannot do this, and already we know so much trouble in philosophy in India, you are contributing to the trouble and all that. And it's across the world. The people have look down on continental philosophy very, they don't think of it as philosophy. When Derrida was given honorary, or they wanted to give him honorary philosophy from the philosophy group at Cambridge, people wrote a letter against it and didn't want him to be given this distinguished thing in philosophy, because they said that's not philosophy. And that, not calling that as philosophy, is exactly the same argument for saying Chinese is not philosophy, Indian is not philosophy. And one of the ways of marginalizing is to say, you take a name for yourself at the margins. You don't become part of the main structure of the discipline, although everything that you do are very similar to that. Maybe there are far more interesting things to say in 95% of the world philosophies, other than the 5% of white European philosophy we are all immersed in. And we don't know how to think about this question, right? I am saying it very provocatively because it is to provoke you. Because how do we think about this? How do we respond to this problem? And it's a difficult question, because when we talk of Indian philosophy, we have run into many important challenges from many Dalit activists, for example, would say, why do you want to talk of Indian philosophy? It's Sanskritic, it's hegemonic. But then of course my counter to them is the two greatest anti-Brahminical atheistic traditions are the Buddhist and the Jaina traditions, who also took a very strong stand against Sanskrit and used Pali and Prakrit. And so there are within these traditions there are enough multiplicity of oppositions against hegemonies, but we don't even encounter that. So this question about philosophy and naming and concept, I'm not interested that we have already discussed enough about that question. I'm more interested in about how we tend to therefore use conceptual terms to describe phenomena around us. What they would say about Indian philosophy is what many times all of us as field workers go to the field and label certain actions of people who perform certain of those practices in quite violent ways, in quite contrary ways, and we need to have an account of that. Okay, so yeah, since we are all on this continental philosophy, let me also end with this final story about it. I think a lot of my work is actually been on continental philosophy, so I enjoy it in some sense, I think. But I don't know how many of you heard about Sokol. The Sokol's paradox, I'm sure many of you heard. So Sokol and Brickmont wrote a book called Fashionable Nonsense. Yeah, it's got a really horrible book. Yeah, the book is called Fashionable Nonsense. It's a devastating critique of continental thought. It's not a critique actually. It's a devastating attack on continental philosophers. And devastating in what sense? They take selected sentences and words from continental philosophers. Everybody is under attack, and they loved attacking Irigaray, and I think Deleuze is also there somewhere, Badiou. Yeah, all of them. Derrida, I think is I think Derrida is slightly different from many of these guys, because I think what he is doing is also very critical philosophy. It's when the English department took over Derrida, it was a problem, But anyway, yeah, a lot of English people here. The point about fashionable nonsense was, what was he saying? What was his argument? He said, how can these continental philosophers use terminologies from mathematics like topology, infinity, continuity, discontinuity, all these kinds of isomorphism, homomorphic, all of these terms which they took from mathematics, and completely wrongly use it in talking about philosophy. And in a sense they were saying what the early logical positivists said. And if you remember, what is the positivist argument against philosophy in general, and particularly continental philosophy? It is not a question of whether it's philosophy or not. They went one step further and said what these philosophers, their primary target was Heidegger and all these metaphysics, whatever. The target was what were they saying about them? They didn't say they were not doing philosophy, etc. They said they are meaningless. What they are saying functions like a sentence, but it's completely meaningless. That there is no theory of meaning which you can have to make sense of a meaning of a sentence of this kind of philosophical writing. That's again, it's like the Brickmont critique, which is in the so-called Brickmont's thing, it was about meaninglessly using terms from science in philosophy in order to legitimize certain kinds of meaningless sentences or broad generalizations, and one of the things I like, as I said, I really enjoy it and I do work with some of these texts, but I also think they have very deep fault lines, and one of the standard ways to be, I think, a philosopher in this tradition is to say both something and its contradiction in the sentence and be surprised by it. Yeah.
Regarding the so-called affair, the problem, paradoxical thing emerges that he is also kind of problematizing science, and we all know that it was published in a famous science journal, and then the kind of
No, it's a reverse. Okay, let me tell you the so-called first story, the so-called hoax.
Hoax, exactly.
No, that is not published in a science story. I don't know how many of you know so-called hoax. Only some of you, not many. Okay, Sokal is a physicist at NYU at that time. I don't know if he's still there. He wrote a paper on, I think it was called, it's some hermeneutic something of quantum gravity or something like that. It was about a very critical, in his terms, continental philosophical critique of modern science, some relativity, gravitational theories. Okay, and he publishes not in a science journal, he publishes in the leading postmodern journal, Social Text. Okay, and with a lot of footnotes and references to Deleuze and everybody else, various places, all these references to names. It's a very interesting experiment. It's about discursive, the politics of discourse. So he writes this paper, makes it look like one of these continental, or he thinks, he calls it postmodern. His attack was postmodernism, and a kind of paper which came out from all these various literary studies department at that time, and then he published it. I'm just kidding, but it was actually a critique of that, and he sent it to Social Text. It's supposed to be a very difficult journal to publish, and they publish it, and it was a meaningless paper because he was really talking nonsense about deconstructing quantum gravity, through some hermeneutic process when every third line is quoting one of these philosophers. And after it gets published, he then wrote to them saying, look, I made this up, it's all a joke, you guys can't distinguish, you have no context of knowing what is the correct paper and what is wrong, you are just caught up in the performance of the text in a particular way. Okay, and if I say the right words and I do this footnote and I quote 10 of your idiots there, you're going to publish it? No, I mean it became a very violent fight with him, and because it was published in Social Text and he came out in public and he told Social Text, now print my explanation of this fraud, and they didn't do it, and he published it elsewhere, and then the whole group of left academics joined him, because the left's greatest problem in the US and in Europe was postmodernism, and fueled by many of these philosophical traditions of particularly French thought, not as much as German thought, and this they thought was the final critique of it, because the left's engagement with science, the idea of science, the concept of science is it's a very Marxian thing, like we talked about yesterday, and that's why science, ordinary people do not have capacity for science, and scientists will have to educate them. It's a very similar, and the science and the left are very close relation in various ways at that time. They are also very close related to the right and capitalism, but in this case they came together and to support Sokal, and all these other guys got really upset and everything. It became a big war, and there are many other follow-ups to Sokal's thing, and so Fashionable Nonsense comes after that paper was published. There was a debate in EPW in which I was also a part of. 4 of us I wrote a critique of Sokal's paper saying what is wrong in his paper, what is wrong in his analysis, not about his paper, that the claim of that, there are many fraudulent papers published in science, but you don't judge science based on fraudulent papers being published, etc., etc. But anyway, so he was talking, the Fashionable Nonsense about critique of the way in which concepts get used up in these philosophical traditions, and I'm sure you see a lot of that when you do philosophy of technology too. Suppose I use certain terms to talk about your experience of technology in the world. How do they actually matter to you? What sense does it seem correct to you? Why would you use such description of social experiences? Why would you do that? Is it cognitive? Is it mimetic? And mimesis is very important, copying, using conceptual terms without understanding them fully is an important part of education. I'm a very strong supporter of mimesis as a form of learning, extremely powerful form. But what is happening to us when we use this, when you want to theorize, not even theorize, let's say you want to describe a field situation, you want to describe a philosophical account, or today, as I said, this kind of philosophy has extended so much that all of you in English departments and sociology, anthropology are all doing that. It's no longer restricted to something called philosophy department where you're engaging with philosophical ideas. So when your philosophical ideas and concepts are penetrated so much and you are using them to describe that world, how are you using them? In other words, after listening to all of this Deleuze, how do those concepts matter to you cognitively, not mimetically? I think that's a question you have to ask. That's the fundamental point of that research part of it, right? Because you may find that some of them really expand the ways of thinking about it, you know. And in support of the continental thinkers, part of it of course begins with Heidegger, but there are many other accounts of it. Part of the problem of why they do what they do is because language, it's actually related to the problem between language and concepts. And you know, Heidegger is a very good example, but as I said, you can have, I mean, almost all philosophers deal with this question, that you have an idea and the struggle of language and concepts is to be able to capture that in all its complexity, because language also reduces complexity of ideas. Just like saying 100 chairs, at one stroke has reduced the multiplicity of this room into 100 chairs. You could then say 100 maroon chairs, then you would say 100 maroon chairs with black borders, 100 maroon chairs with black borders and soft cushions, 100 maroon chairs with black borders, soft cushions and 4 legs, one of which has got wobbly, whatever. You can go on adding to the levels of description, but each time that you do is the difficulty of language capturing your perceptual experience. That's what is for the philosophers and I think theorists. I want you call them as larger theorists. For the theorists, the difficulty is in finding language to match what they mentally see, to use a metaphor of thought. That is, how are you going to understand? You know, you're struggling with the limitations of language. So one of the very good examples, which I think is simple but sufficiently illustrative, you know, the hyphenation use of words, like in very famously in Heidegger's thing, right? So being in the world, and many people laugh at it. It is actually something very profound in using those kinds, and it's saying more about language. What is it about? Suppose I hyphenate a word, being hyphen in hyphen the hyphen world. The being in the writing being in the world as against being in the world has very important consequences. When you hyphenate it, you are talking of the simultaneity of being and world. When you write it temporally like being in the world, you are talking about being occurring before the world, because you could have written it as world in the being. That means very different from being in the world. The temporality of your sentential structures. And this struggle is a struggle about language, capacity for language to be able to say something which you think I am seeing in this room. I can see this phenomena, I have just the language, I have to use it. How can I capture that? And that's a struggle about, you know, that's why you create new concepts. In fact, one of the exercises I always do in my writing workshops, which I do for, you know, PhD students and others, is actually about conceptualization. You know, asking you to think of, come up with, you know, think of a new concept which you have never thought of before. How do you actually develop new concepts to describe the world or experiences? Okay. Okay. So, and you know, as I said, it's endemic. Whether it's about disciplines, it's about this. It's endemic because you can all concepts. And why Sokal and Brickmont is wrong about continental philosophy is because even the concepts within science, which is what he privileges, like mass, matter and so on, they are also borrowed from, actually very paradoxically, they are borrowed from philosophy. So if he is very unhappy that scientific concepts are being borrowed by these continental philosophers, in fact I wrote a paper about this also, but showing what is the fundamental faults of it, and one of the points is that the word mass, for example, comes from theology in the Western tradition, in the English translate tradition. But the word mass has got very different meaning in science than in theology. Okay, and also the Christian mass is related to this mass, the flesh, and then comes down to mass within sciences. And what is interesting is in physics, for example, there is no one meaning of mass. There are at least 4 meanings of mass, each of which are different. The Newtonian mass, the Einsteinian mass, the passive and the gravitational mass, electromagnetic mass, all of them are different fundamentally, but you still use the same word mass. I am saying this because the clue to making sense of concepts, and next time people tell you, oh, Indian concept, Western concept, you should be empowered to respond to these fellows. And the clue to that is to say concepts are never given, they do not have meaning by themselves. Concepts cannot stand on their own. They are always in the context of another theory in which they belong to. A concept, just by if you ask me what is mass in physics, one would think that's the simplest question to answer in physics. It is not. I'll have to ask you, in which theory do you want the definition of mass? Do you want it in Newtonian classical theory, or do you want it in Einsteinian theory, or do you want it in the quantum theory? Do you want it in field theory? Which theory are you talking about when you are asking me the concept mass? That is, conceptual terms derive their meaning not by themselves, but in the context of a particular theoretical construct to which they belong to. So therefore, it is as much true for the word Indian or European or Western or German. So next time when somebody asks you about Indian, you have to ask them, well, I'll tell you what the meaning of the word Indian if you tell me in which theoretical sense am I using the word Indian in this context. Sometimes I use it historically, sometimes its meaning is geographical, sometimes it's legal. If you have an Indian passport, you're an Indian. Sometimes it's cultural. And therefore, the mistake which people do is conflate these different meanings. When I am talking about the cognitive meaning of philosophy, somebody is talking about the historical, philological meaning, the etymological meaning of philosophy. And the same word is not, this is a big problem with language. We use the same words, but we are actually meaning different things. And part of a meaningless debate occurs because we are both saying something very passionately, but you are not talking about the same thing. You are only talking about the same word. The word functions, it gives you an illusion that you are talking about the same thing. We are not talking about the same thing at all. Forget about Indian. I am saying even the example of maths or science, simple things which we take for granted. Two people can fight a lot about maths, but somewhere they should stop and say, okay, now let's go back and ask, what is it you mean by maths? So before you say, don't know this word is wrong, or philosophy is wrong, or science is wrong, you have to ask, okay, first tell me what is it that you mean, what context, under what conceptual, theoretical structure is your concept making meaning? Which means, why I am saying this, and I'll end with this so we can have some discussion, is one, so I'm giving a very radical thesis of concepts, which will allow you to be as comfortable with Deleuze as with African thought or Buddhist thought or Jaina thought or anything else. And you need a strategy for doing it, because the moment you do it, people are going to attack you. So when when people restrict your use of concepts, like Sokol is trying to do to the continental philosophers, when he's saying Irigaray cannot use concepts of solidity to describe fluid mechanics, for example, or planarity or whatever. When you use a particular concept, when you are not allowed to use a particular concept. So when social scientists are say, you can't call your subject science, you can't call anthropology a science. And remember, it's not an old topic, debate. I don't know how many of you are in anthropology, but how many of you have followed the AAA, the American Association of Anthropology had a big public debate 3 years back, I think. How many, 2-3 years back, on whether anthropology is a science. Should they use the word science for anthropology, or should they use the word studies? And Current Anthropology published a small debate on this: is anthropology a science? It's really contemporary in terms of the struggles. In what sense? should something be called a science or not. My point is, whenever you are told that a particular concept you cannot use, most often it cannot be based on cognitive or epistemological grounds. It's not on grounds of valid knowledge. It's primarily ideological. It's a red flag. You can know very clearly under what context you are being denied. I'm only talking about denial. When somebody says, no, this concept, you can't use this word for this concept. And why is this relevant for us? This is the serious question we all have to struggle with, right? And I'm sure all of you have engaged with this question and have followed this debate. Let's look at two very quick examples: democracy and secularism. Okay? And I'm sure all of you are aware of this claim that Asian societies, and let's talk of India now, forget about Asia, because Asia and Africa have been sufficiently trashed, so we can focus only on India now. Indian societies do not possess the concepts of democracy and secularism, right? You have come across this debate, right? Or no? I mean, everybody has responded to Rajiv Bhargava. All of them have responded to democracy and secularism. What have they responded to? The fact that Indian society does not have the concept, they do not possess the concepts of democracy and secularism. Like the German philosophers claim that Indian society does not have the capacity, did not possess the concepts of philosophy, mathematics, logic and rationality. Like Weberian description of societies begins by saying Indian societies, like Asian societies, do not have the capacity for rationality. Okay. So Indian societies do not have the term for democracy and secularism. And why? Why was this? How can somebody say this? What is it based on? It's based on the fact, I'm very surprised that all of you haven't followed this debate. In fact, in CSDS in Delhi, we had 3 years of conference just on this topic, on Indian languages and mapping concepts. Very interesting series of 3 years we did with all Indian languages. And what is the reason for saying this? The reason for saying this is Indian languages do not have a term for democracy and secularism. So if Indian languages, so they'll first ask, did Indian society or societies possess the idea of secularism? Then the first question they'll ask is, what is your word for it? And that was a debate I had with Ginny yesterday, for example. What is a word for philosophy? Oh, but that word is not really philosophy. What's the word for secularism? Whatever you tell me, you say, well, that's not really secularism. So you didn't have secularism because you don't have a word for it. You didn't conceptualize it in your language, and since it's not present in your language, therefore you didn't have that idea at all. How does one even respond to this question? I'm not saying we should all have everything or whatever, that's secularism. There are very many new ideas which had not been thought of, and progression of cultures are like that. But the ideology of this is that there are no progression of cultures of any meaningful idea which comes from the 5% non-white West. I mean, other than the 5% non-white West. Where do you get it? What are the concepts of all these different communities around the world which have become part of your modern day discourse to understand modern societies? Give me any one concept, give me 2 concepts of what there is, how it has become part of it. And remember that the hegemony of conceptual structures is what we do. What they do to these 90% of the Asia, Africa is what the dominant hegemonic systems in India will do to the non-dominant, to the marginalized communities, by denying their capacity for a universal worldview which is applicable to us. And in all my dialogue and debate with these guys now, and just 2 days back I was in Delhi University had organized something with Potsdam University on cosmopolitanism, and I gave the final talk to put things together, and I was again going back to this point. I said the true point of your cosmopolitanism is not about, you know, whether we use Western thought or use Indian thought. Those are all irrelevant right now. But whether conceptual terms in other societies help you in making sense of your society. That is, the relevance of non-white European thought is relevant not whether we use it or not, that is not the point, but whether for those societies they want to draw upon the other societies' understanding of the world in order to make sense of their problems. Just like you would use Weber and Deleuze to make sense of your world views and experiences, can any of these societies ever find the resources and insights, just one little tiny insight, to make sense of their experiences of their social? And it's ironic, and I think the Germans are actually the best at it. I think they're far more, dialogy, they're far more open towards this, at least it seems to me. But I mean, look at this irony. You have Gandhi, you have a whole tradition of ahimsa, drawn from different religious traditions for Gandhi, from the Christian to the Islam to the Hindu to the Jainas, and yet this notion of non-violence and formulations of the human coming from many of these traditions never become part of mainstream German discourse as a response to the Holocaust. This incapacity to even believe that others have something worthwhile for us to learn from, and that the act of theory is not going to be a way of telling the others what they are, rather than recognizing that there is a kind of a process which we learn from their experience. And that's, you know, that's really an ideological problem. It's a political problem, and I don't think it's, you know, okay for us to keep quiet about it. We will have to find ways to do it. We'll have to find very nuanced ways to do it, and in doing that we'll run into various challenges. But I think the first simplest point is to recognize that, you know, there has to be an egalitarianism, a real democracy of ideas, democracy of practice of, you know, the validity of people around you. Not this, you know, so as I am saying this, it's particularly true for researchers, because you are already privileged when you go to the field. You are going and, you know, you ask yourself, why is it that anthropologists and social scientists very often, especially for PhD projects, are all sent to work on those who are more miserable than them or lower in the hierarchy than them? How many of you have, or not you, it's not about you at all, I'm saying it's about academics in the world. How many of us as social scientists would go and do an anthropological work of Mukesh Ambani? I would love to do it. I would love to go sit in his house, or Shah Rukh Khan, or Bollywood actors. You know, instead, you know, you'll have to sit in all these villages with these, learn the language, sit in one hut and whatever, you know, feel like you have to work with the really marginalized, dispossessed. And I think one of our friends was saying that, you know, they are doing science studies thing, and, you know, with the one example you're saying, when you want to go to science institutes to study, they don't let these people come and study the science institutes, because they say, how can you come and study science institutes? What right do you have in that sense, right? I mean, I'm rephrasing it, you can change what I'm saying. Why should you come and study us? What do you know about science to study us? But you go and study a Dalit community or a, you know, sex workers or something like that, you think they're going to ask you, or if they ask you, I mean, they do actually in many cases, say, why are you coming and studying us? You will have, you know, 20-year-old, whether they are from Delhi, Calcutta, Bangalore or Chicago or London, you just suddenly land up in these places and say, oh, I'm going to come and study you, live with you and work with you and write a thesis on you and get a degree and get a job and you will continue with your life as it is. Why is it that anthropology or social sciences is not talking to the above but always to the below? You see, with that very act, there is a very important power matrix, a differential structure. out of which you are supposed to then, and then what do we do? Because we go into such a differential power structure, you tend to theorize them in ways which are, I don't know, I mean it's a very difficult process, and I'm not negating any of this. I know, as I said, my own students do it. I think it's an extremely important form of engaging with the world, but I'm saying the mode of engagement, the mode of going in, is not to tell them what they are or to tell the world what they are, but actually to learn from them, and that's a very different form of anthropological meaning making. Learn from them in what sense? Learn from them not so that I can describe their experiences in terms of some Deleuzian category or Jaina category, whatever. I mean, here none of this matter, whether it's who is who, but learn from them to develop concepts from their own field, in their own articulation. And you might say, well, they don't know what they are doing. This is the colonial argument. The Buddhists don't know why they are entering into these meditative states, although they spent 1,000 years refining it. We will go tell them what their body is like so that they can understand what they are doing. And in many of our social science work, or even writing about Indian society, so it's not even just about field, writing about the world around us, do we do the similar thing? Do we use concepts as hegemonic tools of representing them in our eyes? And therefore, why I am saying, and I'll end with this really so that we can have a discussion, why I think this is very important is because one of the reasons we haven't done it, because obviously all our students, as far as I have seen, are as bright as others who study in other big so-called big universities, but yet in terms of our knowledge production, in terms of becoming leaders in the field, we still haven't done as much as we should have. And part of the reason is because we are still paying a price for this ideological claim that we cannot originate concepts, that we will only have to go to some other thinker to discover concepts which will describe what you are seeing. And the way it has succeeded so strongly is because of the question of language, that you don't have in your language terms which can capture this modern globality. You don't have terms in this language. So you don't have word for democracy and secular. So you have to use democracy and secular from the English language discourse, which may have come from the French and German. The French and the German and the Russians do not do it. They create concepts from within their language world. Look at the most famous one, arguably the most famous, Derrida's use of différent, and how much people have made a thing about différence, right? He just uses a French word and does something with it, brings it into orbit so that we all have to engage with it. So what I'm trying to tell you is that the real engagement with your concepts works when you pay attention to the language, the conceptual terms in the language of your field, in the language of your society you are studying. Within that you produce the concepts you want to develop. Not try and look for some matching with some English concepts, then you have lost the game. The moment you say, for example, there's a very good example, I mean Ambedkar is a very good example, and that's one of the stuff which Gopal and me are just doing in our book, and so I have some very limited understanding of it. But Ambedkar's use of the term Maitri is a very important idea. There's a very important consequence of doing it. Some people have translated it as friendship. There are more nuanced. Aishwarya Kumar has some longer piece on it. Friendship as a concept has been talked, very famously from Aristotle onwards, right up to Derrida. Everybody has talked about friendship. But Maitri is not friendship. If I translate Maitri as friendship and use it to talk about what Ambedkar is saying, then I am forced to respond to this whole debate from Aristotle to Derrida. Although they didn't talk about friendship in English, Derrida's terms in French has been translated to friendship is what we are all stuck with. In the translation of Derrida to friendship, it's not a problem. But if I translate an Indian language term to a term like democracy, secularism, or friendship, etc., you run into deep problems, because you are not allowed the liberty to allow Indian languages to have those terms present. If you translate it as them, they will say you are a revivalist. Derrida can use some term and you can translate it, let's say, into friendship, and then you say, well, is he a revivalist of Greek thought? You don't think he's a revivalist of Greek thought. You will say he's continuing Aristotelian tradition. You translate an Indian word, in a language word, into one of these terms, immediately it becomes revivalist. So how do you, I mean, these are problems you're going to face in your field. It's going to happen to you tomorrow when you write your thesis. How does Indian language term become autonomous conceptual terms in your work without getting dragged into, you know, so if you convert a word as let's say force, then immediately people say, no, no, you are trying to take modern science force and using it in your language, saying you also knew force. But the point is, the modern science force itself is borrowed from earlier traditions which were using the word force, and they take it and they pair it, they make it fit their needs. So you take it and you fit your needs. It's got, you know, languages and concepts don't belong. They are not, there is no IP, intellectual property, for concepts to belong to certain people or certain cultures. Concepts are that way. There you cannot say it's only this domain and nobody else can use it. And therefore, a very creative engagement with the field is your discovery of the potential in the conceptual terms of your field, in the language in which it is posed. The moment you do a naive translation, you may lose out a lot of it, but it is for you as good researchers to discover the potential in the conceptual world which is around you. Yeah.
So just again, I want to give you a practical,
Yeah.
that I find I could understand that the way the land relations that existed, that there is a notion called shopto, they call community property.
Okay.
Right? That's how they deal with their land. So they don't want their ownership over the land. It's only that the land is there. So long the land is there, so
Yeah.
vegetables will be there, and they will just pick them up without the permission of the landowner. So there's almost a kind of mutual sort of
Correct.
tacit understanding that
Yeah.
they will always steal,
Yeah.
but in spite of that, they will produce, and so the produce will be sold in the market. Now this category of shopto, when I'm coming to this and when I'm translating it in the English,
I can see immediately a big debate on that. Yeah.
when I'm translating into the English, English word of community property, it's losing that, the syntactic, some of the other dimension.
Okay.
But the problem is when I'm writing that word in my thesis, and I'm not building it up as a very epistemic category, I don't have the the ammunition rather to build it up as a very epistemic category. It immediately loses the critical balance or sort of that sort of critical articulation. So how to negotiate that particular problem? That why we have to always translate these words into English and therefore losing.
Yeah. So one way to do it is actually to retain that term. Okay. Shakto, is it? See, for example, I can imagine a debate similar to what I have been saying for this word. If you translated it as a commons, suppose you do it as a commons, people will jump at you. What will they say? Commons is a highly valued term which has become part of the environmental movement. It's what 60s usage. They'll say, oh, now you are discovering commons. The idea of commons already in India before we thought of it in the 1960s. You see the point? But their use of the word, so you have to now protect yourself and say, no, I'm not saying that commons, this is a, but when they use the word commons, you could have turned back and said, that is Shakto, you don't refer to it, you don't talk about it, and you think you have created a new category as if nobody in the world has thought of it. Well, that's not true. And now when we use that in the English language, it becomes a big problem of revivalism or whatever, nationalism and so on. I mean, I'm just asking you to be more critical when we respond to these questions, whether it's revival or national. But just so, what do you do? Commons, I think commons are possible potential, but it will lead to this problem for sure. So one way is to retain the terms. retain the terms insistently. So Maitri can be translated as friendship, but you keep retaining Maitri, use the connotations of friendship, explain it wherever context, in this case like friendship, that case it's some ontology of duty, whatever, but you still use Maitri as a word. And who says Maitri is not an English word? And that's the point about words and language, you see. Shakto, is it? Okay, forget about the pronunciation. If you write in English like what? SH? SHA? Oh, SWA. Okay. Shakto. Okay, I can't. Okay. Okay, something like that. So, yeah, you use that word as it is. Why is the word SWATTO not an English word? Who says it's not an English word? SWATTO, is that right? Swatto, is it Shatto? SWATTO is a English word. There's nothing in it which says it is not. You use it, I use it, all of us in this room keep referring to you and saying, you said Shatto, whatever, SWATTO, because no pronunciation, because these are words, written words. All of us in this room start using it. All our community in India, Bengal, start using it. Then we will start referring to it as Shatto or SWATTO, and in 2 years it will be in Oxford Dictionary.
In this regard, I want to mention that the term used as Didi for our Chief Minister has been included in the dictionary.
Didi is a classic example. When we talk about Mamata everywhere outside, I mean among all of us, even from South India and so on, our only reference is Didi. We only refer to her as Didi. So if I meet a Bengali friend of mine and say, oh, what is the news from Didi? We all know what Didi is, but that's a capital Didi, because you are only talking one referent to Didi, it's not a Didi meaning. But the point is, if everybody is referring to her as Didi, it's going to be part of the, there's nothing, what I'm trying to say is, nothing in a language, and this is the nature of language, says this particular word definitely belongs to it or not.
Then do I have to build it as a epistemic category, with the help of some philosophical tradition? Is that required, or just the word?
No, I mean definitely supporting what you need to say, why you want to read it in that way is very important. Okay, and a lot of it should generate itself from the ground, but definitely a kind of, to me I'm always in this big confusion about what kind of conceptual traditions do I want to draw from, how do I make so I was giving this example of this technology, offering prayers to technology and all that. Some of it will fit in very nicely with this materiality question, which has become very popular, as you are also saying, in the West in various ways, and you can read it in their terms of those conceptual categories. But there are also much simpler categories which people who use it and perform it talk about. For example, in terms of the practices of spirit possession, very popular in South Karnataka, Kerala. In fact, I wrote a long piece once on performativity of technology as possession. And for the kind of conceptual terms I was trying to make sense of, to use in this, to understand this process, is from that particular performative tradition, and trying to understand it in terms of that. So, I really think at some level it comes down to the purpose of theory. Why are we doing this? Why do I want to describe and that's why anthropology is far more honest in a particular way. But since anthropology doesn't take this question seriously enough into account, it slips up, and the honesty is this. It says, well, unlike sociology, which may have pretensions to theory, this I am just describing the world that I see it. But like we began this class, description of the world as you see it is already very loaded. The concepts, even 100 chairs, 100 objects, is already so difficult. So that reflection, that even description of a concept is a problem, in which case you can only say what people speak. In other words, you can be a reporter, or worse, good social scientists can only be tape recorders. That is, they just tape what people say and reproduce it. But we think the act of social science and academics is more. So I think we need to be far more confident, that's all I am saying. I mean, the far more experimental with what we do. And when we take on concepts which is not in our thinking tradition, not in cultural tradition, thinking tradition, we don't have the confidence to play with it, mutate it. No, learn from Derrida, learn from Deleuze. What we learn from them is not their use of some concepts and then using it blindly. What we learn from them is their freedom of thinking and the bravery of saying really stupid things without worrying so much about it. No, I am saying, no, so you want to say Shakku, say it, modify it tomorrow, say this is what I am doing, convince it, argue about it, or maybe find a new term, coin a new term. I think that's the kind of one way of doing it. Okay, so we can take some questions anyway, because I know I have to stop before 1. Yeah.
Sir, how do you see the future of STS in India, where scientists does not allow their own domain to enter, and how will it affect Indian science?
You know, for anything to have future, it should have a past and present. There is no past and present STS in India. So, you know, STS is a very, very big problem. As I said, I think the lessons for it for anthropology is also very important, or sociology, that sociologists in India today still do not write about science community. They are still doing colonial anthropology of going and studying tribals. They go and study all the marginalized communities, but they don't want to go and study powerful communities. They won't go study political communities in the way, you know, of studying. There are some studies of it. And in India, the most powerful organization are the science communities. The most powerful in every sense of the word, upper caste, upper class, dominance of every kind is science communities. And you know, why is it that every small country that I know of has a STS program? Even Malaysia has an institute on STS. In India, second largest, or today maybe third largest, scientific and technological manpower in the world. We produce among the world's largest number of scientists and technologists. We can't study STS. It shows really the function of hierarchy in our society, far more than any other place. You just can't study it, because now you know the phenomenon is retired scientists study science. You know, I've been in institute for years, I've been dealing with it. So it's a big problem. We've been trying to raise funds for a really good program on, separate program on studying science. It's been so difficult, you know, even now we're trying various things, but a part of it is because scientists have this reaction against it, and I think because they're a dominant community.
Sir, why are they so scared of it?
They're not scared. No, actually they're not scared. You know what? It's not scared at all. It's a real question of domination. They think we have nothing to tell them. They're not scared in the sense they don't think they can learn anything from us. And see, that's the crucial point about when we study societies or talk about social process. That's why we tend to talk to people who are below us in this intellectual hierarchy, because we can convince them, no, by my intervention you will know something about yourself. Scientists just don't trust, or not even trust, they just don't respect social science. I mean, they don't not just respect social science, they don't respect any of the disciplines. I mean, in my institute long back, we had a very strong gender studies group, and a bunch of retired scientists got it closed down because they said this is not academics. You know, in spite of strong effort by 2 or 3 of us, because they said it's not academics, it's just about, you know, women stories and talking about some stuff. So they're not letting you in. It's just real disdain. They don't think you can contribute anything to their understanding of their own problems. And then on top of it, they want to resolve all the social problems now by doing science. And that we have to take, I don't know if you saw my Hindu piece on the March for Science, and then the big fight which happened after that in Wire. And it's really ridiculous. I mean, here are all these people who had this pretentious idea that social revolution is going to happen because people will go do science. You go learn Newton's laws, you will get rid of caste. And one of those scientists in his response said sati would have been stopped if they had done science. Now, what an, how idiotic can you be? And when I wrote about it, they were so upset as a science community that Indian Institute of Science had a major public debate on this, where they called all the scientists, the 3 directors of ISC and ex-director of NIAS and another scientist. It's all in the web. You see the inauguration of dialogue. So they created a thing called dialogue to talk to science and social scientists. And in this meeting, 3 of these scientists spoke for 3 hours. And then Shiv Vishnathan and me were responding or not responding. We were supposed to speak, but we had 15 minutes each. So we said, yeah, this whole thing is about science and society, and you guys spend 3 hours showing all these, fancy PowerPoint and stuff, and you're surrounded by all these scientists here, and you want us to come and say something for 15 minutes, and the only point I made is that the problem is you don't know what it is to criticize science. They don't understand who can criticize science, what is it to criticize science. But Shiv went off on a tangent. I mean, he was really brutal to the, he was like, it's there in the web. I mean, they were so upset. But anyway, the point is, this is what we need to fight. So I must tell you that one of the good consequence out of all that, the Wire and the Hindu thing, was that quite a few social scientists came together. So some of them got in touch with me, and we said we'll even maybe think of a volume to write about this issue of where we say how to deal with science, how to deal with science communities in India. And we need to ask that question because an enormous amount of money is being spent on that. When they started the ICERs, I was in the curriculum committee of ICER Mohali. So first 3 years I was there. When I went the first year, I was shocked. Every student who came to ICER got 5,000 rupees as scholarship. So this is after 12th. It's like you're going and doing BA, you get 5,000 rupees for studying arts. Every student in ICERs, and they upscaled their thing from 20 people to 100 students. And I came at that time when I was in Karnataka. Social science students in many of the universities in Karnataka wouldn't get 5,000 rupees. And if they got 5,000 rupees, they'll come after 6 months. And you know what happens in the case of Rohit and others at HCU. I mean, it's an absurd thing, and nobody's asking the question, what are the social scientists doing? The kind of money which has gone into these institutions is enormous. And I think we have failed a lot because we don't have an STS program.
Sir, all the institutes of national importance that are
Yeah. Exactly. There is no institution of humanities in India.
they are called institutes of national importance.
Correct.
While the burning issue is that
Exactly. Very correct. I don't see why they don't get it. We have tried all kinds of arguments. There are no major well-funded social science institutes. We can't take number of students. Everything is a problem. And very mediocre work in science gets funding from DST. Mediocre. I'm saying so mediocre, you'll be shocked at the amount of money which is being spent on that. And that's why some of them want to go and resolve social problems. They will stop sati by teaching them Newton's laws now, because that's the only way they can justify this absurd amount of unaccountable, non-justifiable spending of money in the name of whatever, nation, defense, etc. Governments like this, scientific community has always been very close to the government. They don't care. You are Stalin or you are Modi or you are Rahul Gandhi, it doesn't matter to them. They always, have their patron from government. And they are there deciding policy on water. Today, water problem, because I am part of so many of these groups at NIAS, because we have a very strong retired scientist group there. Water problem, every time they'll come and say, oh, water is the greatest problem. Next war, water, all that stuff. And they all have solutions. Each one is somebody from DRDO. The guys who are building weapons till yesterday are today coming and telling us they'll build systems to supply water, like they used to supply missiles. And there are no social scientists in those committees. These four, and they're all males. These 4 or 5 guys sitting there and telling you how the social problems will be resolved. And the social science community is just keeping quiet. It is a big problem, yeah.
So my question is again an observation on retrospect, and this is basically something to do with the Auschwitz incident that
With the
Holocaust, right?
yeah.
And my question is with the two concepts of conceptualization and mass mobilization. Now, the idea of being non-animals as that have been conceptualized by a particular few have been put into agreement by quite a huge number of people from the nation state. Now, the conceptualization on the first primary basis happened within a very small, you might say, intellectual circle, but that instigated a huge turnout of mass mobilization who kind of ended up thinking in a similar fashion. So how does conceptualization perpetrate into the society, mobilizes such a huge extent, which we also find in communal balance today.
Yeah.
So how does that work?
Yeah, that's it's a difficult question in the sense it looks like mapping a big social process, but one of the ways in which it happens is through policy, and typically and that's why today a lot of focus is on conversion of academic knowledge to policy. So suppose I want to do for this water thing, for example, is a classic instance of where we can see how many new concepts are now becoming part of government policy. And once it becomes part of government policy, say dictated by these committees, they become part of the language of the society. All the right from the gazetteers, it will percolate to every small district office. Everybody will start using those terms, and once you start using those terms, it has its own. So very good example you can see is even in the way in which the idea of poverty gets taken up within the state debate, right? So you have poverty. So we know that there's a lot of poverty, but you have no clue what you mean by that poverty. What is your set of ways in which you would engage with poverty? When poverty gets translated into policy, it becomes a particular kind of a quantified term. So you will either have calories or daily earnings or nutrition values, all that stuff, and then that percolates everywhere through every policy document, and through policy document the implementation in poverty stricken areas are all using these conceptual terms. So by the time you are done in 20 years now, you go to any of the slums in urban slums in Bangalore, for example, you know exactly how this word poverty in the government meaning, in the government conceptual structure, is reproduced every day there. There is a local guy who will have an office who will sit and tell you what the government policy on poverty is, and he will be using all the government terms for it, and and all the people who are there will go use that term to get the funding from that. So it really becomes as if it's part of social reality, but it's actually a part, and that's why good social science work is also about finding these powerful concepts which are translatable into policy and then into the social term. There are many which are not, like Sanskritization is a very good example of an idea which captured the imagination. And in MNS's case, there's other word which he coined called vote bank, which also became very popular. So much so it's become so popular that nobody associates with him now, at least some people in sociology do. The point is this, that in those cases where it's not about policy alone, it's the popular media, writing in newspapers, in those kinds of things where it became a very popular. So so journalism has done quite a bit to transmit certain values of valued concepts, And that's why the media question is also actually quite important for social science in ways in which we normally don't discuss it.
I have a question. The first, what are the barriers between the Indian society to the progress of the science and rationalist ideas? First.
What is the obstacle?
Obstacles, yes. And my second question is how the science can be spread without the state funding. In respect when, particularly, I'm giving you reference in 9th August of this year, a nationwide protest, which is called the March for Science in India, was initiated. Right? And for that purpose, you have given your comment, and it was published in Dawar magazine that the demand for March for the Science is actually unscientific. Right? Now, in this regard, particularly in the capitalist society where there is a enormous inequality and the state itself is engaged in the spreading of inequality and unscientific ideas, what kind of measures can be taken except the demand from the state to spread the rationalist and scientific ideas which are which can be proved in any way mean it can be in the laboratories and it can be in the field like some society, some observable and some reliable things like that. So what is your opinion?
My opinion is, so since you correctly said that, I think these views of science, which the March for Science was based upon, was itself an unscientific view, in the sense they did not take into account the practice and the empirical nature of science. People who are ideological about science will claim science is this, science is about logic, truth, rationality, etc. But there is no empirical evidence for that. What do I mean by that? The practice of science is far more complex and rich. In fact, it shares a lot more in common with literature, imagination, fictionalization, as compared to any of the other so-called logical disciplines. In fact, it might interest us to know that logic as a discipline, which is associated with rationality, is never a primary requisite for science students. You will teach them mathematics, you don't teach them logic. You don't do any logic as a discipline, and only people who do logic today are computer scientists, because they use it to write computer languages, not because they want to be rational, because it's the easiest computer language to write, it's a machine language to write. You can do a PhD in physics and not have known the basic definition of logic, because science knows very well that logic is actually quite irrelevant to the practice of science. So when people invoke certain notions of logic and rationality within science, you have to question them on what do you mean by this. Not buying, I'm saying buying into the being critical is not to criticize and demolish them and say we won't have anything to do with you, but to develop a kind of an engagement where you can ask them, okay, can you explain to me?
Actually, sir, I was a part of it, and when a demonstration was organized in Kolkata, some of the eminent scientists, the director of Saha Institute, the director of Bose Institute were actually present, and they emphasized that the science does not only mean the experiment in the lab, but yes, what you are saying that the rational or logical engagement with the subject, with the people must be there. And that is
but what the question is about rational, because you have, forget about the ISRO scientists and the chairman going to the temple. You have these prayers to machines in all our science institutes. You have maybe 60-70% of scientists going to temples and astrologers. If scientists themselves don't have scientific temper, how do you, after doing so much of science day in and day out, how do you expect all of us to have scientific temper? And what should we do to have scientific temper? Let's say it's good, we'll have scientific temper. 50 years of doing science hasn't given them that. So what do you think we should all do to get scientific temper? What is a method? So let's assume that it's a goal. Secondly, all you have to do is to sit in a faculty meeting of scientists in a science institute. It's the most irrational, like all meetings, faculty meetings everywhere will be very irrational, contentious, people will be fighting. You should actually realize that the processes of taking people, giving awards in science, getting into the science academies are all very contentious. People find it very difficult to assume as if all these people are suddenly so-called rational in their own actions as part of science communities. Then when they want all of us to be rational, then you have to ask them, please tell us how, so that we would like to, let's all be scientific tempered, very good. But when you yourself don't know how to be that, then what do you want us to do, right? Well, that's what I am saying. The scientific temper is not cognitive, it's ideological. It's a way. Why were all these people fighting? Why did they come out on a march? They never came out on a march in millions of social atrocities. They came out on a march for 7th pay commission. They didn't come out when the poverty index was going up in India. They didn't come up and say this is happening, let us give 100 rupees of our salary after this inflated 2.5 lakhs they get a month.
So they did not come when the poverty line was.
They didn't say nothing is there. I mean, yeah, their engagement in this sati happens. They are not there on the field in the sati. Afterwards, they will write about something. I don't know what it is. They are not going to go to Rajasthan and take a stand on it there. Why? Because they have important science work to do. Though I don't know what, because after all these years of scientific funding for our science community, our total impact on world science is about 0.3%. What have we produced in the last whatever decades? Can we ask this question? I'm not criticizing them, I'm saying spend more money. In fact, in my response in Wire, as I said, the point is give more. I would support more funding for science. I will march with them for more funding for science. What I disagree is their 4 points claims. And if you also marched on behalf of that, you should be very worried. Remove your name from that. Why? One of them, what is one of your claims? You said 10% of it should be given for science education, which is only but then the next point is very important. What does it say? That you should only teach which are scientifically proved. My God. What are we going to do with the literature, arts? What are we going to do with speculative philosophy, speculative social science, in the sense speculative, not fanciful, but things which are not under naive control of scientific experiments. Science is possible because you can take this and tear it and burn it write a paper saying it burns, it melts at 62 degrees. Scientists would like to have the freedom to do that to humans also. Unfortunately, as social scientists, we don't want to give you that scientific evidence. You burn when, at what temperature will I jump up from the chair? And you can do a scientific experiment of it, right? I think that clause is unpardonable. Because, and I don't think people should have marched on that clause. They should have said, look, there are a lot of scientists who are very open. They are very good thinking people. In fact, many of the scientists whom I know, including some very famous names whose names I won't mention, after my Hindu article wrote to me saying, thanks for writing this, because they know that it is true. The president of one of the academies was very furious at the scientists' reaction against it, and many of the scientists' reaction, by the way, were by people who marched, and they were left theatre activists. They were not even scientists. And this is the great function of ideology. Your foot soldiers are not scientists. That is, the people who are passionately fighting, like be more Roman than Roman, or like many Indian academics, be more German than the Germans. You fight far more for that than they themselves. Many of the scientists are the ones who actually said, well, maybe there's, this is not what we are saying. The people who organize the march, by the way, they are proponents of science. They are not scientists. In the sense, they are supporters of, they think of this science as a thing. Environmentalists and others. None of your big scientists were actually the organizers of the march. In fact, one of my close friends in Bangalore, who is a who is the one who actually sent me the link to this March for Science website, and for which I wrote this nasty response. He is a very good physicist, and he was so disturbed by it, he wrote them a long mail saying what they should do, and he sent me a copy of that mail also. And it is these people who refuse to change any of that. So it is actually about those 4 points, and about how scientists have to understand that their responsibility, and they have all become, like our friend was saying, as a social scientist they won't let him into the compound. How can you do that after you have completely non-social audit for Indian atomic energy, space programs and so on, and it has been in thousands of, you can't even count the amount of money which has gone in. How can they let you not enter into a public institution? IISc, the place I am in the whole campus is such a lovely campus, 400 acres of beautiful trees and stuff, and with all the security guards everywhere. And it's very nice. I go in and sit, I don't have to see the world. I can think of solving Sati problem from my room, which will be nice protected room. But I am saying, scientists have to be a little more responsible about it. And I really don't want to say scientists, because I am telling you, I know that's why in the IISc debate, when Balram, Roddam Narasimha, etc. were there, none of them supported this extreme idea of this march. So somewhere in but my point is not about scientists at all. This is just the final culmination of years of struggle of doing science studies. But I think it is also an attempt to sensitize the social science community, because they've been keeping quiet for too long.
Sir, the recent bill by Karnataka government called termed as anti-superstition bill. So in that bill, there is a debate like what practices not to be included and which are to be excluded from that, and there was that the religious practices which are in support of the people has to be excluded because they cannot be included in the bill. The anti-superstition bill, and then it was revised. How do you? That was certainly based on the notion that what is superstition according to scientifically proven as very religious, but should not also hurt the notions the sentiments of the people of Karnataka, that the religious practice should be excluded from it, but the practices like killing animals for pujas should be excluded. So how that that question of making a bill policy on the basis of science and totally in the hands of people who are sitting in the legislature assembly should be taken into account?
No, this is a very, very difficult issue, in saying something about it. The reason is this. I know there have been terrible instances. In fact, one of the Dabolkar memorial lecture at APU I gave, in the second one I think, and I realize, I am very sensitive to that question, and I know what is happening is very wrong. But I also think the solution to that, as looking at it as some draft bill or some vague science idea, will solve that. But because the problem is so bad, one has to look at it a little more seriously. But like it has happened in Dabolkar and maybe Kalburgi, maybe Gauri, Lankesh also, it's actually very little to do with superstition and irrationality as against political power. It's very clear. Everybody knows it. The Karnataka government knows it. The people who killed Dabolkar or Kalburgi are not, in fact, they are ultra rationalists. If by definition of rational means a utilitarian calculation, which is one very important definition of rational, right? The utilitarian rational, which is my capacity to anticipate my decisions and the consequences of my action, and based on that I do the following action, which is what the foundations of economic rationality is, and so on. These guys are completely, in that sense, very rationally guided, because they know exactly what they are doing. Same thing what happened with Gauri Lankesh. Their use of irrationality and superstition for their political ends is a very rational act. And what is very sad is that they use examples of certain practices of common people as an excuse to promote their politics. It's not about, they have no stake in those so-called irrational practices. They are not killing Kalburgi because they want to have children sacrifice or whatever. They are capable of doing that child sacrifice. I am not saying no. They are crooked people, but they are criminals. You have to draw a law to deal with criminals, right? And this false imposition of science is not helping us do that. That's all I am saying. It has distracted the problem to the extent that we are not able to deal with it as a political problem, which is see this as right-wing political groups on whom action must be taken. You are only protecting those right-wing political groups. It's got very little to do with this. Secondly, the kind of cases on which this is based about fraudulent forms of these things, if people extend it, and they should be a little bit worried about it, there's a lot of quackery in modern medicine, and as you know, it's already happening. There's a lot of, Bangalore at the same time last 2 weeks back tried to bring in a bill about medical doctors, and the whole of the state went on protest, the doctors. So, there is a lot of that. So, how do you then distinguish that a lot of medical practices which are at the level of quackery are not put under the superstitious practices bill? What is it that is defining? I'm just more worried about the conceptual ordering of this and the way in it's been argued than about the real ground level problems and the number of cases by which these problems happen and so on. I think, but having said that, I do, as a political problem, if you really push me to take a stand on this, I'll say as a political problem, it is a deep problem about superstition. But as individual people's practices, that intervention in the name of science is a bigger problem. Yeah.
Thank you so much, sir. Listening to you on two occasions, I was there as a participant for one of the programs that you organized on reading Gadamer in 2009.
Oh my God. Okay.
It's very nice, and coming here back and listening to you as a student, this again, adds on to my memories. I have three questions. In the sense that one related to what you said in terms of being considered as humans. One is in terms of how we clarify and define concepts, and the third is an experience which I have had as a teacher in a college in Darjeeling. Let me start first with when we talk of humans, as you said, especially in cases of genocide or cases where there is a case of some kind of victimhood, etc. My understanding is that, taking from clues from my engagement of conducting interviews with male persons, relatives of women who were raped in Mizoram. For those of us who don't know the entire history of Mizoram, just in addition, Mizoram is one of the states, Aizawl in special, is it marks itself as distinct because it's the only territory within the Union of India which was bombed by the Indian Army itself. So the memory of that incident of the army, bombing Mizoram, shelling Aizawl, and the raids which were conducted during by the Indian Army, CRPF, etc., for controlling the insurgent group of MNF, holds strongly even in public memory now. So I conducted the interviews of men who were witness to those raids. They were, they said that the Indian army was not human. The Indians were not human.
Yeah.
They were animals. So, so those who inflicted, but then I didn't conduct interviews of the armies. The army, say the Mizo rebellions and people who were supporting the rebellion as not being humans, and it was also vice versa was
Yeah.
also true.
Yeah.
That's one. Next is when we come to using local terms for defining moments or issues in society. I am in particular very, very uncomfortable with James Scott because everybody knows that if you just Google, you'll see that James Scott he has defined zomia, but the whole idea of zomi as a healed person, it is emic, how we call it in anthropology. They call themselves. It's like the Bengalis calling themselves Bangla. If today, let's say I'm a white-skinned person, and I use the term, and Google shows, or maybe other sources of knowledge show that this particular white person from maybe Germany is the one who is coined it. Why do we not information, that it's not coined by them, that the idea or the word preceded their whole information, and that they have gone to the field, they used it in their work, that's fine, but then they are not the source of that coinage. The third point where I'm talking about, the experience level in terms of science, non-science, and English as a definite category, all distinct together. Is I happen to be in the when I was teaching in a college, I happened to be in the admissions committee, and this was really interesting because there was a girl who was a topper, and she was very good in science, but she wanted to take mass communication. So the father of the student came to our that committee's place and said that I'll tell this in Hindi though he spoke in Nepali. He said that मेरी बेटी तो टॉपर है साइंस में पर मास कम्युनिकेशन लेगी बोल रही है. Why is she ruining her career? अगर आर्ट से अगर लेना है तो she could have taken English. So there is a whole idea of degree of which are the subjects which are to be taken.
Right.
And it just shows the way we privilege certain subjects. And coming to this issue of how unscientific science people or so-called science people can be is 2 points. One, on one occasion, we had a colleague who studied from this institute, IIT Kharagpur, and again to JNU, and then he got a job in our college, and then he moved to some central university. This fellow, and then there was one physics department teacher who happened to represent India at South Africa with the postdoc in physics, very big fellow. Both of them were arguing, and they were coming to a conversation, and I happened to be present there. They were telling that we're wasting so much of money by doing this road building exercise. We're using tar for building it, concretizing it. We should find ways of sustainable and very economic way of doing it. इसमें हम लोग को घास चढ़ा देना चाहिए. That means we should, on the roads, instead of using tar or cement, we should make it green. So I just told them very nice scientific ideas, but the only problem that I have is that on the grass, when cars will move, automatically the leaves will die, that is the grass will die, it will become muddy. So we'll be going back to the roads of the cattle time, when the roads were muddy and bad. That's one. The next is, in one case, one of my colleagues who was from science, again with doctorate from science, etc. She was from physics. She was about to have a baby, and her father told her that Rahu Kalam hone ja raha hai, and then the following days there were going to be some solar eclipse or something. So this lady, she took chutti from the college and she moved down to Siliguri to deliver the baby on a cesarean, so that it could avoid those kind of things. So scientists themselves practicing these kind of things. So how do we even deal with it?
Yeah, okay, a lot of issues, much of which I think we talked about. I think, this question about, so the point about being a science, so one way to make sense of it is that you can be scientific in certain domains of thinking. Like as I said, I can do evidence for seeing at what temperature the sun melt, but that can be scientific, and it is wrong to say, oh, it will melt at 10 degrees, because I can test it to see if it melts at 60 degrees, and that is possible to do it. But when it comes to human vulnerabilities, and this is what I was also giving in that Dabholkar talk, that when you consider the nature of humans, and vulnerability is a very central core of being human, then these kinds of things do not seem to work. So we make sense of our life through these forms of whatever it could be, superstition or whatever. And if we believe in autonomy of humans, then we need to give them that capacity. But what happens when scientists and others speak to this, they are very hegemonic in their expectation that what they are doing is wrong. So one of the examples I gave in the wire response is that a lot of scientists smoke, and if you had told them, and earlier it was very, very common, definitely with Bengal and all that, like 90% thing, and everybody knows as a scientific evidence about smoke, let's say, because they are only saying, they are the ones who are saying scientifically smoking is bad, and then 90% of the scientists are smoking in certain communities. Then what do we tell them? Do we tell them, no, you are being very unscientific, you are therefore unscientific in everything, you can't do physics because you smoke? What is the implication? Are we unscientific in everything just because we are unscientific in one part? So let's assume this person goes and does this Rahu Kala, whatever. So does it mean she is unscientific because one event she does whatever, you know? So I think the science community doesn't thought enough about it. So that's why it's a very ideological drive. And I know, for example, that a lot of the march is driven by the fact they think they're getting less money, funding is less, and it's ridiculous the kind of funding they get. I know for new faculty who are taken in, of course IITs also, but even the ICERs, somebody told me that he said, oh, you know, he was given a grant of 2 crores with various buying equipment and so on, and he was very unhappy about it. And I said, man, that's really, you're living in a good place where a government institute can raise the funds and give you that much support, and you feel, no, that's not enough, I can't do my science based on that. You know, so I think, yeah, I think a lot of the march for science, I mean, this is just a cynical view, but a lot of it is driven by more funding for their postdocs, students, 7th pay. They have all been very vocal about that, by the way. I haven't seen any of them say, let's take, C.N.R. Rao has been saying it for a long time, but them say, okay, I'll take a big cut for the whatever. And the other very important problem of Indian science is they have never engaged with solving the problems of Indian society. Prigozhin once came and said, you know, the Nobel Prize winner, there are 2 big instances, one C.N.R. responded and one G. Padmanabhan responded, one in Trivandrum and one in Chandigarh. In this big science congress, he came and said, why are Indian scientists talking about doing astronomy and particle physics with such terrible roads and garbage disposal and water? Why is all this such great minds in your country not spending 10 minutes helping resolve some of these issues? And then the scientists all got upset and said, how can these fellows come and tell us what we should think about, what we should not? We are also, why should we not think about the universe? The point Prigozhin was asking is not about that. You are saying, why, when there is so much of public funding at stake, why don't you spend a little bit? If you are so clever and so intelligent that you can resolve black hole structure, I'm sure somebody can resolve what to do about our roads. We still depend on Malaysia to build our roads. So that is the part of the problem. I mean, I think, so there are just too many problems with Indian science, I think.
Most of the agriculture equipments.
Yeah, in every step. Yeah. No, and pesticide use, water technologies, nothing. I mean, and IITs were supposed to have mediated that in a very important sense. You know, all the IITs, and some little bit they have done, but for the kind of support over the decades, and if you really want to do an evaluation of the impact on basic societal technologies, it's miserable.
The oldest IIT is in this is the oldest IIT.
Oh, is it?
Yes.
Oh.
This is the first IIT of India, and we can see the condition of city.
Condition of the city.
Of the city.
Exactly.
What this IIT has given to Kharagpur.
Yeah, and
Almost nothing.
can we ask that question?
We should ask.
That's exactly the point.
Why should not be?
That's what I'm trying to say. The science community will say, no, we are discovering some neutrons charge. Okay, very good.
We will not learn how to make cheap roads.
I totally agree with you. And water, where is question of human dignity and social dignity? And what science communities have got away with is because you build a nice wall around it, and you put 2 security guys, entry and exit, and that's it, you know. And you will get your power and you will get your water, and it's an extremely important question.
Most of the professors of IIT have not read the clause that tells why IIT was established.
No, but whether they are or not, what is worrying is that the government or the governance of these institutions do not expect them to see. If all the faculty are told, you do whatever work you want, get Nobel Prize, nobody will stop you. But you know, in between we have to take a call on how we impact the world around us, the social world. If you are so concerned about social world, then how come you are not asking, as you correctly say, there are open ditches which cause, you know, how many people would have died in Kharagpur because of bad sanitation? Is that a responsibility? The scientists will tell you that's not our responsibility, that's politicians. Not true. The kind of money which has been invested in Kharagpur would have been much more than any of the other organizations, except I heard you have a big railway junction here, so I'm sure a lot of money has gone there. but I don't know if that's been more than the money put into Kharagpur IIT. So yeah, but if can we ask these questions? Is it okay to ask them? Can we expect responses to that, etc.? Yeah, very quick point about that. That was an interesting point you said about that term which is used, and I think it reminds me a lot of the IP problem with turmeric and other things, you know. So there's been a lot of local knowledge which then becomes part of global knowledge through certain mechanisms, and now concepts are also like that. They're all, you know, can we ask IP for concepts? And I definitely think there have to be some responses to these kinds of questions. I think we just normally keep quiet largely. So okay, any last question? I have to leave. Yeah.
This is about the problem with the